I talk about the specifics of the time then, the conditions then, because I think I'd want to argue in the next session that circumstances now are quite different, and we should hear from Carol about Trident and what the new circumstances imply about that and about conversion in relation to Trident. But what I want to emphasise is that we've moved from a situation like in the 60s and 70s, particularly with Vickers, but also with Lucas Aerospace. Vickers included Barrow because owned the shipyards in Barrow until nationalisation in the mid-70s. But basically, in those companies at that time, there was, from a corporate, point of view, not always, there has to be sometimes pressure, or sometimes it came out of peculiar circumstances. But there was a recognition of the importance of diversification to keep teams of skilled workers together. So it was kind of in the corporate sort of agenda. Their reaction to Lucas, the Lucas Combine Committee, was so hostile because the initiative was coming from workers, and to concede any diversification plans coming from the trade union would have been an erosion of managerial prerogative. And Lucas Aerospace were absolutely dogmatic. That was like a kind of a bottom line. They were not prepared to even negotiate with the alternatives. Even though, as Phil was emphasising, a lot of these alternatives were completely, although they were socially useful, they could also be profitable. There were markets for them. But management prerogative stopped it. But one of the things that was happening during the development of the plan is that designers, particularly, in being asked, one question on the Combine Committee's questionnaire was, what products have you worked other than military? And most designers had a history of working on other products because of this management sort of emphasis on keeping the teams together. And in Vickers, I worked, as I said in my talk this morning, that I worked for the Vickers Combine Committee. And I went over to Barrow, and there, the designers, although they weren't, sort of as political as somebody like Mike Cooley, they were already working on alternatives. Maybe sometimes in company time, but they were doing it as a trade union around renewable energy, particularly wind power. And then I had an extraordinary interview the other day with a guy who wasn't exactly a top manager. He'd been a sort of project engineer in Vickers. And he's now 90. I interviewed him in a care home, but he was an amazing guy. I just have to tell this story because it's sort of indicative of how things were then, and then I want to quickly draw the contrast with then and British Aerospace now in Barrow. So I'm rather focusing on its implications for Trident, which I think is the big issue for arms conversion, but there's a wider issue too. So he was a guy, he was a Quaker, and he'd worked on TSR-2, which was some dreadful military, I just remember my brothers doing airfix kits of TSR-2s. It was a sort of military symbol in the 60s, I think. Anyway, he was a Quaker, and he was telling management that it was against his conscience to work on it. He was a senior engineer. Anyway, initially management said, oh, get on with it, fuck your principles. And then he just persisted, and they said, look, okay, then go round Vickers and explain your position, and maybe, someone else in Vickers will pick you up. And he did this, and actually, through various go-betweens, management in Barrow picked him up, brought him to Barrow, interviewed him and so on, and said, okay, he'll do. And what they then asked him to do is to lead a process of diversification from military submarines to, not socially useful, but to civic, products. And so he then, being a Quaker, I'm not evangelizing for Quakers, but I think it's interesting. His approach was egalitarian, so he was a bit like a sort of Lucas initiative from on top, which is maybe why in the end it sort of didn't get it. But he then involved workers in trying to get their ideas. It was a bit more than a suggestion box, because management wanted the ideas. And out of it came the idea of deep sea exploration, submersive. I think I call it submersibles, but I think they're meant to be submersible. Anyway, and this was a whole new market opening up, and in a way, through the knowledge of the workers being appropriated by management, they got into this submersible manufacturing, which was like designing independently and then getting the product made in the yards. And it was incredibly profitable. And then came nationalisation. And although the relationship between submersibles and the shipyard and the submarine production was integral, the management of Vickers, interested just in profit, as it were, and not, in a way, not really understanding the technology, they agreed in the process of nationalisation to allow the government to have the shipyards, and they would keep the submersibles division, you know, because it was so profitable. And that happened, but of course it was disastrous because of the separation. And in the end, you know, this guy that I interviewed left, and the whole thing sort of collapsed, although now somebody's taken it up and is, you know, running a nice private business out of it. But that is just a story which indicates that, you know, there was this tradition which meant that trade union pressure had greater possibility of working within a particular site. Now, in Barrow, to take the kind of key example, British Aerospace is absolutely adamant that it's going to stick to its core business. I mean, British Aerospace is a you know, multinational company. So if things are a bit tricky in Barrow, you know, if there isn't if Trident is delayed or there's some, you know, problem with government orders, British Aerospace can, you know, cut jobs in Barrow and move investment to the United States or wherever. So it doesn't need to keep together those skilled groups of workers. So there was, in the 80s, there was an initiative which came partly from one of these workers in Vickers that I talked to the Combine Committee and involved, to create a Barrow Alternative Employment Committee. And they worked away at alternatives. I mean, there was a bit of reluctance and management was very hostile. And by then, British Aerospace had taken over. I suppose privatisation had led to British Aerospace running Barrow. And, you know, they were pretty hostile to all this. So this committee increasingly, you know, came up against a dead end. And I interviewed the guy, one of the guys who'd been running it, and I said, what lessons do you draw? He said, well, the lesson he draws is that there can't be, you know, site-by-site conversion. It's got to be an industrial strategy. You know, it's got to be, in a way, Ministry of Defence and Ministry for Industry working together on a whole shift nationally, you know, of industrial strategy away from the domination of the military, which, I mean, Carol can say more, but, you know, our economy, you know, in spite of the Cold War, I mean, supposedly ended, there's supposed to be a peace dividend. Actually, that's all complete crap. You know, the military is still, you know, particularly with the decline of manufacturing, or rather the destruction of so much manufacturing. Manufacturing is pretty much dependent on military production. So most of the big companies, like Lucas, all depend on military orders that kind of subsidise the rest of the company. And British Aerospace has this absolute sort of refusal to consider diversification. Also, with Trident, there's a whole kind of chain of production involved. And the technology of producing submarines in Barrow has become more and more sort of narrow because diversification is off the agenda. Then they've focused on increasing productivity on their core business. So it's become more and more technologically specific. So workers have less and less possibilities of imagining, you know, how their skills could be used for different purposes. So, I mean, the lesson from them, I mean, there were just on other plans. I mean, Vickers, the stewards there, did develop alternatives around tanks, alternatives to tanks and so on. So there were a lot of initiatives in that earlier period. And I suppose what I'm trying to say is there's that history, and we can learn from that, not so much to replicate the site-by-site model, but more to say this shows that actually in developing an alternative national strategy, you know, building on Jeremy's idea of an arms conversion agency, the resource that agency must utilise and organise is the design and engineering capacities of the workers. So we have to convince unions like Unite that, and I think, you know, it's possible that, you know, if Unite was approached more in terms of, okay, it's not about Barrow, it's about, or even about Trident, it's about developing a whole national strategy of arms conversion away from military domination. They might be interested, which would obviously then affect positively Barrow and make each company less dependent. But it would mean that in Barrow in the northwest there was a regional strategy, you know, and part of the National Investment Board that Jeremy Corbyn had wanted to create, that was devoted to implementing a non-military industrial strategy in Barrow. So that's for the later discussion. The only other good thing to mention about Barrow is that politically there's a lot of interest, not necessarily involving the workers in Barrow, but it involves people in that area who obviously depend economically on Trident. But they've voted against, a vote of no confidence against their MP, John Woodward, who is like a nuclear evangelist. At least Ulverston did, one of the constituencies. I'm not quite sure if the Barrow town has as well. And then the whole constituency, Ulverston and Barrow, actually nominated Corbyn, you know, who sort of everybody knows is against Trident, for the leadership. So, you know, there's some interesting political dynamics, and there is this history, but it's, as Carol will confirm, it's a difficult